Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. I'm very excited to speak to you all today on the topic of cultural leadership and overcoming biases, and to build on to what Nikki and Brian also shared. I'll start off with just sharing one of my favorite quotes on leadership and culture, which is the culture of an organization is a shadow of its leader, which really just highlights the responsibility and the weight that we carry as leaders to rally different and diverse individuals around similar values and expectations, which of course is not an easy ask or task, with us as leaders also trying to find our stride and balance. Next slide, please. So what is cultural leadership, right? And so for me, to sum up cultural leadership, it is positive and impactful influence. It refers to driving change and commonality in approach towards shared values. I describe it on my slide as the hallmark of global leadership, right? Because it becomes more prevalent as a factor for leaders with global and diverse teams, diverse workforces, in multinational environments, and leaders that are leading across cultures and continents. So when I think about the challenges that I have faced as a global leader that make this an uphill battle, which I'm sure most of you can resonate with, there are four key ones that I'd like to draw on that global leaders encounter as they try and shape a team culture. The first one is communication norms differ, right? Naturally. Some cultures prefer, for example, formal over non-formal communication. Some prefer written over oral communication. Some cultures have unspoken and non-verbal communication norms, which all really just complicates effective global leadership. The second one is cultural values and value conflicts. And here we can consider the fact that different cultures have different views of leadership. There are cultures that have what we call a high power distance, where hierarchy is important. And then there are cultures with low power distance, where structures are flatter and there's not much regard to, or importance of hierarchy. The third one, which is probably the most complex that I have had to deal with on my leadership journey, is stereotypes and biases, because as a global leader, you're dealing with employees with different views and perspectives that have been shaped over a long time, right? Influenced by their upbringings and experiences, and as much as you're dealing with your own views and managing your own biases and perspectives. Then the last one is environment influences, which refers to societal norms and factors that influence behaviors and how employees show up at work. Next slide, please. So considering all these challenges that the global leader faces, there's a need and there's really just an urgent call to us, all of us as global leaders, right, to rethink management beyond its traditional definition, especially in this era of globalization and this concept of global workforces. There needs to really be a continuous push for cultural leadership as a key competency, which you see on my slide here, and as an enabler actually for successful global leadership. And so if you think of it as a competency, there are two areas or skills that global leaders need to build up to be more effective in building cross-cultural teams. On the left there, you'll see a concept called cultural intelligence. This speaks to leaders intentionally building up intercultural knowledge, right? It's as simple as it sounds. I mentioned earlier that there's some cultures with power, some nuances with power distance across cultures. There are also different conflict management norms. And so understanding cultural and societal norms, and how those shape your team members' behaviors, it really provides a foundation on how you adapt and navigate as a leader. So this brings us to cultural adaptability, a key component of cultural intelligence, which is intentionally putting cultural sensitivity into practice as you seek to build relationships and establish alignment between teams from different cultures. So, for example, this can be something as simple as consciously adjusting your interactions, right, to social structures where hierarchy is important or valued, right? So following due process expected in terms of hierarchical interaction when making decisions as much as possible, where possible. And so you'll see a quote there at the bottom as well, which I also quite was drawn into, that draws that interaction between cultural and emotional intelligence. So cultural intelligence picks up where emotional intelligence leaves off. And these two concepts are distinctly different, right? Emotional intelligence is important, equally important for a leader. It's the ability to recognize, understand, and manage your emotions as a leader and others' emotions. While cultural intelligence extends to action, right? Working actively, adapting to diverse environments, taking those actions, that align to the knowledge that you've built up. The second component of cultural leadership, that this competency, is cultural influence. And so what's important to note here is the interdependency between these two, cultural intelligence and cultural influence. Because cultural influence involves leveraging your cultural intelligence, so all the knowledge you've accumulated, to seek and to unlock commonalities and values between your team members, right? It's important to have shared values. I think Nikki mentioned that as well as she was presenting. And those can really help you rally everyone together around a common goal. The other side of building cultural influence is the art of communication. Again, as simple as it sounds, something as simple as adjusting your communication to written, where written communication is preferred over oral communication. That can actually increase your effectiveness as you lead globally. Next slide, please. So what are some of the practical tips that global leaders can apply? I like to look at it in a three-pronged approach that you see on my slide here. So it's invest, it's clarify, and it's exchange. So firstly, on the investment side of things, leaders have to have courage and create the space to invest in training and resources that facilitate cultural awareness in their teams. And as much as building a coherent culture rests on you as a leader, as per my earlier quote, you can't do it alone, right? So you'll need to build those champions in your teams, typically your direct layer, your direct reports, if you've got a large organization, to support you on your journey and to really champion the cultural awareness in your team. And then secondly is clarify. And so this involves having models and guidance, so having some structure around decision making and collaboration in your team that will help foster consistency, transparency to decision making, and it limits the subjectiveness that can often come, with biases and perceptions. I always say with clarity comes the opportunity for accountability. I know Nikki also touched a little bit on clarity, right? So having KPIs linked to the use of some of these models and these inclusive norms that you set within your team, it really helps you to hold your team members accountable to reaching the culture that you aspire to. Lastly, exchange. I really love the concept of cultural exchange. And so what this involves is just creating the space, it can be in your team meetings, to acknowledge and celebrate different cultures, right? While also creating that opportunity for team members to share openly on their cultural history, on their influences. I find that this open sharing, it fosters inclusiveness. It gives employees a sense of belonging for team, and for team members, they feel like they are heard and they people do care about them beyond the work, right? It creates that psychological safety. Next slide, please. So I mentioned before that stereotypes and biases are the most complex to deal with. And again, Nikki and Brian touched upon those as well. And they truly are barriers to effective global leadership. Again, you'll see the quotes. I'm a big fan of quotes, that rings true at the left side there is that leadership bias is the hidden enemy of successful leaders. So we all have biases and assumptions that we come with based on our history, our experiences. And some examples of some of those biases, you'll see some on my slide there, which is affinity biases, which is being more inclined to, naturally we're all inclined to people that are similar to us. Proximity biases, which is being more inclined to people close to us physically. It can be in the same continent as you. And then lastly, confirmation biases, which is, we typically process information in a way that's consistent with or confirms, what we believe to be true based on the perspectives we have. And so some of the ways we can build the bridge across these biases as we manage our teams and as we manage ourselves are, firstly, self-reflection is very important. I cannot stress the importance of self-awareness and intentional role modeling for your teams, right? So those small little intentional practices on embracing different cultures are important, bringing it in your team meetings and role modeling it for your direct reports. And then seeking feedback as well. We probably all don't like feedback, but seeking feedback is important, right? And that can be, a simple practice like having a diverse hiring panel, just so you can check your biases. Self-check your biases is something that Brian also spoke about earlier on. So it's important to bring in multiple perspectives to check yourself. And then asking questions to learn is the third one. I like to use ideation sessions as an example for problem solving with my team members. I lead a global team. I want to hear all the ideas. So when we've got a project and time allowing, I do like to have those ideation sessions to hear all the perspectives. And you never know what you can learn, in terms of best practice from practices like that. And then the next one is providing structured and consistent feedback. Being fact-based, for example, as you are doing your employee reviews is important. Again, I know Brian mentioned this, making sure that you're having people check you as you're doing some of your employee evaluations, having those accountability partners is equally important. Then lastly, as I mentioned, inclusiveness as a KPI. I think that is one very important aspect. What does not get measured doesn't get improved. So cascading inclusiveness as a team norm, as an expectation for your culture, and holding people accountable for it is important. And that marks the end of my presentation. I hope this has been useful, and I'll hand over to David.
Thank you, Nancy.